Citroen have always had a bit of a unique view on how the motor car should be, which is good because I like a vehicle that can be a little bit different. But the year is 1991. Citroen have got a small but loyal following, and your new car has just gone on sale. It's this, the Citroen ZX, and the reaction to it is a little bit mixed. To understand why the reaction to the ZX was a little bit mixed, we have to look back at the Citroen family tree. The predecessor to this was the Citroen GS and GSA, which ended production in 1986. It was a hugely successful car, but it left a bit of a gap in the Citroen market, shall we say. Of course, they still had things like the Citroen BX, which was a good middle ground between the C segment, which is what this is, and the D segment, which is slightly larger, I think more along the lines of the Ford Mondeo type of size of car, if you want to have something to point as a reference. But the thing is, over the years since the GS and GSA went out of production, that particular market had grown. In fact, the competition for it had grown absolutely fierce. The thing is with that market is it made up a third of overall European sales, and Citroen were basically just missing out on it. They needed to have something that was going to fill that gap, but their slightly weird, slightly different and quirky approach really wasn't going to cut it in the 1990s. So obviously when they revealed something that was a little bit more, say, conventional compared to their usual stuff they put out, it obviously had a mixed reaction, because Citroen just went for a car that was a little bit more, I don't want to say dull and brought down compared to previous models, but in a way, compared to what Citroen had built up a reputation of doing, it kind of was. But obviously it was going up against things like Ford's Escort, which at the time was desperately in need of new engines, Volkswagen's Golf, which was going to be replaced with a newer model later on in 1991, and Vauxhall and Opel's Astra, which again was also going to have a new model in 1991. But naturally in France it was taking on the likes of Peugeot's aging 309 and Renault's 19. So it had some pretty fierce and stiff competition to go up against. So before we get into the really nitty and gritty about the car, why don't we just have a quick look around it. So first of all, this is the facelifted version of it. It's obviously got a bit of a face that matches in with Citroen's current lineup. It's got a nice grille. Obviously that's a grille they carried through to the follow-up of this, the Sara. Turbo diesel. You can see on the roof, lack of peel. Bit of an issue with this particular car, but it's not something terrible. Little specks of rust coming through, but that's okay. They're only surface at the minute. One thing I am seeing in here is a little bit of Jugosana. Now the thing is, the Citroen was designed by Bertoni, obviously an Italian design house, and the Yugo was designed by Giugiaro, very well known for other models of car out there, and also with the team of Zastava designers who worked at Ital Design, also an Italian design house. In fact, if you want to see, Euan, the owner of this car, has brought along Citroen ZX booklet and Jugosana, and that kind of shows you, I guess in a way, the similarities. I think one of the largest similarities between it is that window. You can see it. But obviously Sana, much more based on Fiat, I guess, in design and certainly engines, because it used engines from the Tipo, whereas this very much Citroen's own kind of thing, I suppose. Yeah, I don't think it's a bad looking car at all. It sits nicely, it's got a nice shape to it. Motoring journalists in the 90s described it as having a bit of a dumpy rear end and a very nicely styled and very smooth, very French front end. But overall I like the proportions of this car. I don't think it looks bad at all. And look, it's also got a single wiper like a McLaren P1. It's probably the only time you'll ever hear a Citroen ZX likened to a McLaren, but there you go. Looking underneath the bonnet of the ZX, you're greeted with the XUD engine, an engine absolutely iconic amongst PSA group. And the thing is about this particular engine, the diesel and also larger petrol engines, it was canted back slightly because that way then Citroen could get a better centre of gravity with the car, and also it helped to reduce understeer, which I think was a fantastic bit of engineering. You can see just how far back it is compared to the front. There's actually really quite a large gap. And you kind of have to lean over a little bit, but if we look here as we usually do for accessibility, to get to the lights is nice and easy down this side. There's nothing in your way. Same on this side, so a good mark for Citroen just there. I'm guessing this is maybe your dipstick. Yes, it is, just there in orange, very nicely marked out. Obviously, it's power steering fluid. That'll be your expansion tank. Currently, I can't see the washer bottle anywhere, but unless that's it at the back. No, it's brake. Oh, there it is, right there, hidden away, tucked away at the back. Again, very neatly designed and packaged. But yeah, accessibility to pretty much everything in here is really easy, especially the alternator. Look at that. And the oil filter, again, you don't need to take anything off, which for the DIY mechanic is absolutely perfect. And look, battery, nicely laid out just here for you. Really, it's a very good piece of design just under the bonnet already. But I think we'll have a look at the inside now to see what happens with the design there. Let's close this up first, shall we? See if I can get this right. There we go. I never claimed to be a professional. So getting into the ZX, massively easy. The doors are actually a little bit heavy on this. If we get in, can have a good look around at the dashboard, and as we've mentioned already with this car, it's actually really quite conventional. But what isn't quite so conventional is this little panel here, which is a little bit awkward at the minute. Maybe that's just a fault with this particular car, but it hides the radio. But something which is unique, I guess, to this is the fact that this is a radio that only seems to work in the ZX, so having that little panel just to cover it up, I guess, doesn't quite make sense in a way. But yes, if you have a look around in here, window switches just here, nicely laid out, but they're in a bit of a weird angle, so maybe you're expected to sort of lie back like you're in a comfy armchair with it. Handle down here, door pocket down there, presumably maybe a fuse box or something. Alarm, I'd assume, button there. Buttons located up here, which from this particular angle are okay, but obviously I'd imagine if you had the steering wheel up a little bit, because I believe it is adjustable to some extent. There it is, yep. If you have it up, you can't actually see those. So let's just bring it back down. Nice and easily done. But yeah, fog lights, hazard lights. That's got a solid clunk to it in the relay. Lights located on the indicator stalk, obviously wipers. And as we mentioned the radio already, we'll move on to the heating controls. Very, very simple and laid out. And look at the ashtray, that is absolutely massive. They're expecting you to smoke loads in this, and look, there's even a cigarette in there. Very French. But yeah, if we have a look at this, very, very simple layout. Obviously fan speed 1 to 4 and obviously off, and then you just got the direction. You don't need anything more than that really in a car like this. 5-speed gearbox, as you can see on here from the very old gear knob, which has since come off, which is why it's had this replacement on. Handbrake, nice, easily available to you there. It's actually a nice position. The driving position feels really nice. Where's the horn? Horn is on the end of the indicator stalk. Again, a very French thing. But one thing that is really, really rather strange to this is the fact that you need a code, I suppose it is, to get the car to start. Again, a little bit strange, but it's Citroen. You expect a tiny bit of quirkiness. But unlike Citroens of old, which maybe had the lights and everything else on a little column just off here to the right, or potentially even just located down here in the glove box, but no, as I say, on this it's all located to hand and really easy and conventional. Sitting here, the interior space feels really nice and spacious even, and airy, and look, because you've got the sunroof as well, provides lots of natural light in here. I like it. I do like a sunroof. Sunroofs are always fun in my mind. But yeah, the front is a really nice place to sit. I quite like it. Let's see what it's like to sit in the back. Right, if we move the ZX and Yugo Sana brochures, which again are very exciting, I'm looking forward to reading those actually. If I sit in here, this seat is in my driving position, and as you can see I've got absolutely no knee room at all. Foot room is really quite good, and headroom. I mean, I'm quite tall. I'm about 6 foot, 6'1" depending on which tape measure you're using that day. I've got a reasonable amount of head space. Not a huge amount. I've basically got hands width though. So imagine if you go over one specific bump, then you might have a bit of a problem. Other than that though, sitting in the back, it's quite a nice little place to be. The seats are comfy, very soft and squishy. Again, a very French thing. We have a look here. There's not really anything of interest in here. Oh, actually, we have got this little light which doesn't seem to be working. Maybe the bulb's gone on that. Grab handles when your driver's being a bit enthusiastic. And look, you've even got very tiny little felt rear seat pockets. Oh, I like those. I like those a lot. And of course, again, an ashtray in the rear of the car. But even sitting in here, visibility, you can already see that is extremely good in this, because of course, being a 90s car, all the pillars are really thin. It makes you feel happy sitting in here, and as well, as I mentioned, comfortable. Of course, you've got these headrests as well, which will come out, but no central armrest in the middle here. But then again, what do you expect? Now, I know one feature of other ZX models was to have the rear seats slide forwards, but I don't think this particular model has those. In fact, why am I grabbing that? Let's try this. No, it doesn't. Never mind. Another feature I like, again, 90s seat fabric. That's always something nice to really look at. But one thing I have noticed sitting in here in the back just now is if you look at this, your view as a passenger in the rear of the car is not really that obscured by anything. The seats are really quite low. But again, when you sit in the front seats, you just sort of squish down in them. I'm starting to like this car a lot. But again, I love these fabrics. Anyway, let's go and check out the boot. It's quite easy to get out of as well. Coming around to the boot of the Citroen then, to open it, you've got a little button just down here at the bottom which you press in, and the boot lifts up. Again, it's quite heavy, very sturdy. If you look in here, obviously you've got some things in the back, but these are all just various little bits that you and the owner of it's got in it ready to prepare it for a later date when he plans on fixing little things on this car. But overall, it's not too bad in here. The load lip is quite shallow in comparison to many other cars in the same class at the same time. 343 litres of space as is. With the rear seats folded down, you get, I think it's about 1146, something like that, which really isn't bad. Split fold 60/40 rear seats, you just move that slides forwards. In some models actually, you can have adjustable backrests to choose between load space and passenger space. And also they've got like a little flap that just comes in between, well, basically where my hand is, to fill in that gap. Again, very creative by Citroen. If we have a look underneath here, is there a spare tyre? I'm going to interrupt the flow of this video for a moment and say actually there isn't any space underneath the boot floor, because the spare wheel is located under here. I forget that about Citroens. I like this. This is actually located in a very strange place, but actually it's quite, I guess, logical when you think about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's meant to go in there. Yeah, let's put it back for him. But overall, it's a nice size of boot. But if this isn't enough for you, the ZX is capable of towing trailers and things like that as well. Brake trailers you can tow up to 1100 kilos, and unbraked it's about 625, 450, depending on the model. I wasn't able to get a very specific figure for that. If you want to have a roof box or something, yes, you can have one, and you can have up to 70, 75 kilo. Again, it depends on the particular model. But overall, really, the ZX is quite usable. But if we close the boot, you can see one problem that's quite, I guess, common on these, and that is this. You'd quite often see Citroen ZXs with this parcel shelf string hanging out. Supposedly it's meant to retract inside somewhere, but I can't quite see that. So they always just sort of hung out like that. So we'll put that back inside. And also, one thing to note, very typical on 90s cars, this sharp corner edge. Make sure there's no children standing behind that, it would hurt. But yes, this is the ZX, having a look around it. Nice car, nice feel to it, very spacious inside, very airy. But I think it's time to take it out for a bit of a drive and just see how it performs out on the road. So welcome then aboard the Citroen ZX. Now this is a car I've actually waited to drive quite a while for. You see, my aunt used to have one back in the early 2000s or so, and I was quite curious about trying it, but at the time I was about 7 years old, so that was never going to happen, was it? So it's quite fun just to try a different car. I think hers was a similar age as well. I think it was about 1995-ish, so maybe just about pre-facelift. So the ZX was launched in mainland Europe in March 1991. We here in the UK got it in May 91. And at first it was only launched with petrol engines, with diesel engines following on later on in the year. At the time, there were 4 petrol engines. There was a 1.1, which wasn't available to us in the UK. There was the 1.4, which was the base engine for the UK, that was about 75 horsepower. You had the 1.6 litre and the 1.9, which was also shared with the Peugeot 205 GTI. Obviously a car that is now massively iconic amongst hot hatchbacks. The 1.6 produced about 90 horsepower, whereas the 1.9 was between 120 and 130, depending on whether you had manual or automatic transmission. The 1.9 was only available on the highest spec at launch of the ZX, with a 1.8 litre that was either 100 or 110 horsepower, depending on the trim that you got, 1.8, and also a 2 litre 16 valve, which produced anywhere between 120 and 170 horsepower, which I think is really quite considerable, to say the least. Diesel options were a lot less varied. You had the choice of either a 1.9 diesel naturally aspirated that produced 70 horsepower, or you could be fancy and have a 90 horsepower 1.9 turbo diesel. This particular car's got the turbo diesel, so it's the better one of the two. In the entirety of the ZX's life, there were 3 body styles to choose from. You could have a 3-door hatchback, a 5-door hatchback like this particular car, or you could have a estate. Although I will say the 5-door was the first to launch in 91, the 3-door came later in 92, and the estate was 1994. As we've already mentioned, the GS and GSA were the predecessors to the ZX, but the ZX, unlike the GSA, didn't adopt the comfy but complex hydropneumatic suspension setup. This was a lot more conventional. Again, it was a way to keep costs down and also to appeal to more people. This had independent torsion bar suspension at the rear, and also it had McPherson struts at the front. When the ZX launched in 1991, there was a lot of upset about it at the time, especially from Citroen fans and journalists alike. They claimed it wasn't a proper Citroen. They claimed it was almost insultingly sensible. Maybe even really, it could have been classed as boring compared to previous Citroen models. But the thing is, they needn't have worried. Citroen are masters at designing a car. You don't have a car for so many years, or have a car brand, shall we say, for so many years, and not know how to build a good car. That's just fact. Citroen had actually worked really hard to prove that the ZX could perform, and could perform well. But this is Citroen. They couldn't really not touch it and make it a little bit odd and quirky in some way. So Citroen decided, hey, why don't we give it some form of rear wheel steering? Passive rear wheel steering, they called it for this. And basically what that means is when you go into a corner, the rear wheels steer slightly with the front wheels to aid you in the direction you're going. And why this was needed on a small family hatchback, I'm not entirely sure. I can understand it on the hot hatchback version, shall we say, but on something like this it doesn't really make a whole load of sense. But Citroen did it anyway, and it proved that they could still be a little bit quirky, even with something that, at least on the face of it, was outright aimed towards the sensible, the conscious buyer. On launch, the ZX had 4 different trim levels. You had the Reflex, which was aimed at a younger audience, primarily female, who wanted something a little bit stylish. You had the Avantage, which was aimed at the sort of more conscious middle ground family buyer, shall we say. And then you had the Aura, which was a bit like the Avantage, but a little bit fancier, had some fancier trims on the inside of the car. And then there was the Vulcan, the sportier version. It had a stiffer suspension setup, which made handling that little bit better. I mean, driving this, the handling on it's pretty good as it is, but on the Vulcan, they went that little bit extra and made it a little bit stiffer. In fact, at the time of launch, the Vulcan, when it had a turbo diesel installed, which produced about 90 horsepower, but it could do 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds, hardly sporty by today's standards, but for the 90s, for a diesel, that was a really big deal. Anyway, at the time, that was one of the very first hot hatchbacks that had a diesel engine that you could buy on the market. So there we go, 1 point to Citroen for a little bit, I guess, of some form of originality. Anyway, fun fact of the review. Citroen, because they like to be a little bit quirky, decided to go against the grain of calling their new ZX trim levels a range. Many manufacturers would have called it that. But no, Citroen took inspiration from the fashion industry and decided to call their new trim levels, instead of a range, they called it a collection. I don't know why, I don't know what that particularly adds to it. Maybe it adds a touch of class. But either way, you could see Citroen really cared about the car and how they wanted to market it. The ZX was available from anywhere between £8,700 and £12,700, depending obviously on which trim level you got. But the thing is, looking back now, here in 2023, you can still pick these up at a reasonable price. You can pick them up for anywhere between £350 and £3,000, again obviously depending on the trims, which does actually make this car quite an affordable way to get into retro motoring. In fact, I can see a car like this being extremely welcome, shall we say, at an event such as Retro Rides or at Radwood. Over the ZX's life, it wasn't just limited to those 4 trims of Reflex, Avantage, Aura and Vulcan. Other trims were added later on. As mentioned already though, you had a 2-litre engine, and the one that you could actually get for it was a 16 valve, so it was pretty quick. I think that engine produced something in the region of 170 horsepower, which is quite crazy to think about it in a car of this sort of size. I know obviously again today's cars are massively more powerful, but for 1990s that was pretty quick and pretty powerful. Citroen also released the Furio, a slightly less sporty version of the Vulcan, which was aimed to fill a gap between the really more hardcore Vulcan and the slightly softer Aura spec, I suppose. It was a good middle ground, especially for the younger buyer who maybe couldn't quite afford the insurance of the Vulcan, because of course cars like that in the 1990s were very prone to being stolen, as we very well know, as history will tell us. Of course, on top of that, there were other special editions that came along later on that basically rode the wave of popularity that the ZX set when it was launched. Of course, it took a bit of time for those Citroen fans and journalists to come around to the idea of their not a proper Citroen actually being a decent and actually well-built car. The quality in here is really very good. Obviously, at the minute, I'm driving a car that's 20 odd years old. You're going to expect a few rattles in here, but at launch, it was claimed to be as solid as the Volkswagen Golf, which is constantly put up there as the benchmark for many brands and cars to basically slot into and to beat. The thing is though, as successful as the ZX was, by 1998, 7 years after launch, it was all over for it. Sales had declined and the all-new Citroen Zara, which actually was based on the same platform as this, was in. However, it may have been over for the ZX in Europe, but far away, over many seas and lands in the world that we know as China, the Citroen had been on sale since 1992, and it was still on sale there in 2013. Okay, admittedly it wasn't necessarily called the Citroen or the ZX, but it did exist in that market under different brands. I think it existed under the Dongfeng brand and also the Fukang brand. I'm quite interested to see what YouTube Auto subtitles that as, to be perfectly honest. Whilst the ZX only lasted for 7 years, it did place its benchmark down extremely well. It was a successful road car, and once people had gotten over that bias of it's not a proper Citroen, people started to like it. They really did. But the thing is, it wasn't just successful on the road, it was also successful in motorsport. It was a Paris to Dakar rally winner 4 times, 1991, 94, 95 and 96. It was the FIA World Cup for cross country rally winner 5 times. It was also the FIA European Rallycross winner in 94 and 96. Citroen, as we know, are very good at rallying, and it was this particular car that helped really cement that in the eyes of the public. But this car that I'm driving here on test today is a 1997 1.9 turbo diesel with 90 horsepower. It's actually been a local car all of its life. You may have noticed from the external shots we're in the New Forest. And this car was bought brand new in 1997 from Penton Citroen in Bournemouth. It now lives in and around the Fordingbridge area, which is where we're filming today, which is why we've met up at the Fighting Cocks pub, where we've actually been before for the Driven 24/7 social. It's low mileage for the year. It's got about 109,000 miles on the clock at the minute. And although, okay, the XUD engine underneath the bonnet on this may not be quite as sporty as the one in the Vulcan, it is still capable of 0 to 60 in 12 seconds, which is pretty respectable, I think, really. Whilst this particular car is actually low mileage for the year, this car was destined to go to the scrapyard until current owner Euan actually saved it from ending up there. It had a few little problems, and the previous owner basically deemed, oh, it wasn't worth me fixing. So one day whilst driving along, Euan saw it for £500, and he had been looking for a ZX and thought, oh, it'll be a little while until I get my hands on one, but he found this one and he bought it £500 later, and it's still going. It's a credit to what the car's basically able to do, its legacy. Okay, you may have seen from external shots that the bodywork maybe isn't in the best condition, but Euan, and I think his family as well, have also been helping out to make it as mechanically good as it can be. And I can guarantee it is mechanically good. I've been driving it now for quite a little while now, really, and it's not skipping a beat. And he said the other day he went down to Bournemouth in it, take it home for a little bit, and it did 8 hours solid running there, no problems at all. So I'd have faith in this car to do a very long journey if it had to. There's no reason why I shouldn't have faith. It's safe to say then this car is a bit of a work in progress at the minute, but Euan does actually plan on getting this car a full body respray at some point, fixing all those little cosmetic issues that it's got. It's quite nice to see somebody who, at the age of 19 nonetheless, is actually taking an interest in a car like this that would otherwise have gone to the scrapyard. It's stories like that that make a car have character. If you want to follow the adventures of this particular car, you can do on Instagram. Follow Bella_the_ZX. I will put a link down in the description below. So then, we've had all the information on the ZX. How does it drive? Well, it's extremely comfy. As I mentioned already, the seats really squishy. They hold you in nice and firmly as well. The pedals are a little bit heavy, but it might just be the age of this particular car. The gearbox, nice and solid. I really like that. Changing gear in this car is an absolute pleasure. Visibility, absolutely brilliant on this. You can just see out everywhere again, partially because it's a 90s car, pillars are narrow, but generally it just feels like a lovely place to be. It's nice and airy in here. It's spacious, as we've said. The brakes feel good. Steering, whilst not the most direct thing in the world at the minute, as you can see I'm getting a little bit of wobble on here and it's not really turning, but it is still direct enough that you can still have a bit of fun with it. Okay, I haven't necessarily been taking corners at speed in this today, but you can feel that rear axle turning with the front. It's a little bit odd at first, but it does make sense. It really adds to the driving experience to this. In fact, having that on the rear of the car made it a formidable force in the 90s. It was a characteristic of the car. It was so good at handling, not many other cars in the same class could match it. It's only really now that companies are exploring that four-wheel steering system again. And of course, we can't forget the engine underneath the bonnet. XUD diesel, the soundtrack of many people's childhoods, I'm sure, especially if you grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, late 80s even, like I did, except I was 90s and 2000s. But the engine on this pulls extremely well. And the things with the XUD, it's tried, tested, proven, whatever you want to call it. It's pretty well bomb-proof. You can't fault it. Of course, the world at the minute is having a bit of a war on diesel cars. They don't want them going in the cities, they don't want them doing this, they don't want them doing that. But this car drives so nicely. I do like it. The last car I drove that was anywhere near as comfortable as this was David's Peugeot 205. I will say this is a car that makes you feel happy. It's nice and airy. What more can you want from a small car? And it drives very nicely as well. In fact, the steering wheel on this is actually really quite soft and squishy. It's a little bit odd and weird. Thanks for watching this review on the Citroen ZX. Citroen's adorable and rather different car in the 90s. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment down below, let me know what do you like about this specific car. Do you have memories with one? Please leave them down below, we'd like to know all about them. And of course, if you want to see more car-based content, especially reviews, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Anyway, I've been Jake, it's cold out here. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next video. Until then, farewell.